What's up, founders, and welcome back to my channel. Super happy to be here. My name is Asia Orangio, and I'm the CEO and founder of DemandMaven, where we work with SaaS companies and startups on troubleshooting their growth, defining go-to-market strategy, and reaching their very first growth milestones. Today, we are going to be talking all about how to run customer research interviews like a pro. There are just a few tips that I have to go in with confidence and come out the other end with all of the insights and just juicy details that you need to ultimately apply to your business. Okay, the first thing to do in a customer interview whenever you first join the call, it's gonna seem really awkward to say to make sure that you actually do this, but do actually thank the customer and just welcome them to the interview. When you take charge as the interviewer or the person asking the questions, it really puts the customer at ease and it makes them feel like you kind of know what you're doing. Right after that, give them an overview or just the high-level view of how the call is going to go. So when a customer joins the call, they've been welcomed and thanked, of course, for participating in this research. The next thing that they're probably wondering is, okay, but what are we actually going to be talking about? And then also, what are some of the other things that we're going to jump into as we go through this interview? And just giving them an overarching view of that is going to be incredibly helpful. It's going to give them a sense of where the conversation is going to go and what are some of the high-level things you're going to touch in the interview itself. What I like to do is I actually like to just say, hey, we're going to start out with just talking about you, your role, the business that you're in, some of the things that you're currently working on, and then we're going to move over into discussing the product. And then finally, I might ask you just a few follow-up questions about what we've discussed. Even in an overview as simple as that, again, it puts the customer a little bit at ease, but it also gives them a sense of okay, I know where we're ultimately going in the conversation. Whether we've got 30 minutes or an hour, either one, the customer then knows, okay, got it. I know exactly where we're headed today. Okay, this next one is absolutely critical. Please don't ever forget to do it. But right after giving the overview, usually most customers will say, oh, that sounds great. Awesome. Wonderful. Let's get started. And before you jump into your questions, ask this question first. Is it okay if I can record? I cannot be I just simply can't express how critical the step is. It is such a critical step. Always ask to record. Most people, almost 100% of the time, will say yes. Very rarely will you ever get a no. And if you do get a no, it's usually because they have an objection that you can then quell or calm any fear about. So for example, what I like to say is, hey, just before I jump into my questions, would it be okay if I hit record on today's call purely so I can take good notes? And usually whenever I say purely so I can take good notes, most people say or think, okay, this isn't going to be in the court of law in the future. I mean, this, it's probably okay for me to be really open and honest about, myself and some of the things that maybe I'm working on and also some of the challenges that I have. And most people, like I said, usually never have any qualms about it. It's so rare. I've run hundreds of customer interviews by this point and prospect interviews, and very rarely do people ever have any hangups about the actual recording itself, especially if I give a disclaimer. So do not forget to ask if you can record the session, and then also don't forget to, if you would like to add a disclaimer, you can absolutely use that as well. The reason why we ask for the recording is because, yes, you are absolutely going to take your notes, you're going to listen, you're going to type, you're going to ask questions and follow-up questions, you're going to do your thing. But the recording is your backup, and that recording is actually worth its weight in gold. The reason why we ask for a recording is that way we can actually get a transcript later. I highly recommend using whatever service minimizes the effort that you actually have to put in manually translating anything. So use tools like rev.com. You can absolutely use different recording AI software, especially if there's one in particular that's your favorite. But as long as you get an accurate transcript after that you don't have to put hours of time in later or after the fact, after you've already bought it, that's going to be a pretty good transcription tool for you. But the reason why we need it is that way we can actually parse this customer research later and actually turn this interview into something that is data-driven, and then we can therefore apply it to our other functions in the business, goals in the business, challenges, anywhere we can apply the insight. From there, it becomes an invaluable resource and a wonderful tool. But my favorite part, I think, about the transcripts are, yes, they are going to be something that you will pull insight from and be more data-driven about, but they are also a perfect just garden for copy. So if you are writing copy, if you're writing for the website, if there's something that you would like to describe better, if you kind of feel like maybe some of the messaging is weak, you can use the transcripts to inspire how you would say something differently. So that's why I personally love them. And I always recommend, even if you're doing an in-person interview or you're talking to a prospect, bring a recorder, record the conversation. I promise you it's going to be worth it in the long run. Okay, so we've asked if we can record and the customer says yes. Awesome. Now we can jump into questions. But before you jump into your questions, yet again, this might seem obvious, but make sure that you actually have your interview questions in a document where you can take notes. What I like to do is I like to have my document ready to go. I've got every single question with some space underneath to actually enter in what the customer or the prospect's responses are. And that just saves me a bunch of time in the future. If I ever want to jump back to my notes about how the interview went, I know exactly for more or less what the responses were for every single question, but it's already outlined and organized for me. Make sure that you've got something similar, and also make sure that you actually have a plan for the questions that you're going to ask. Don't wait until the last minute to scramble together and pull together some questions. If you're doing a customer research project of any kind, make sure that you're actually approaching it with some kind of strategy. There's going to be really specific questions to ask, and then of course it's going to correlate to what it is that you're hoping to troubleshoot or to solve or to figure out. So make sure that you've actually got your questions in a place that is really readily available to you and you can actually take notes in. Maybe it's a template, maybe it's something copyable or duplicatable in some kind of way. But then also make sure that you actually have good questions. It sounds kind of obvious, but if you're, like I said, waiting till the last minute, your interview might be a little bit awkward. And then you also might be a little bit disappointed and kind of feel like customer research doesn't work because you've been asking the wrong questions anyway. So that's what all this is for. On top of having your questions in a place where you can pull up and you can take notes and do your thing, one thing I do recommend is to actually list your questions out in the order or the flow that you think that they're most likely going to work in. And what I mean by that is you can ask questions related to the past, the present, and the future, but if it's not necessarily in order and you're jumping around, it actually is a little bit harder for customers to get into the boat with you and go down the stream together. And you'll find that if you jump around your questions and they don't really go like in a logical order, it's going to be harder for you to craft a narrative and craft a story later. On top of that, however, you'll find that when you do jump around, it's harder for the customer to actually make connections in their own mind. They kind of have to do a lot of extra heavy lifting to kind of like go back in time and then suddenly jump to the future and then jump back in time and then they have to do a lot of, it's just a lot of like gymnastics basically like in their mind. But I have definitely noticed that when my questions aren't in flow though, I usually don't get deeper responses, or I don't necessarily get like the deeper insight, or we end up only scratching the surface on every single one of the questions. And I just find that when you do go in order, the customer can build on top of every single response and answer after that, and usually end up getting more information when they are in flow. It's also just much more natural. Like, it's just easier in general to just go with the flow in that way. I've tried both ways, and I gotta tell you, it's just way better when you go in the flow. It just is. Okay, finally, you can ask your questions. When you ask your questions, this is really, really, really important. It's really important. Just ask your question and then don't say anything else after. Shut up. Don't say anything. Don't answer the question for the customer. Don't give them options or solutions that could be what it could be for as an answer to the question itself. If you answer the question for the customer, I promise you, I guarantee you, they'll latch on to whatever it is that you say. This is something I've talked about before, but while human brains are absolutely wonderful devices, magnificent devices, 10 out of 10 highly recommend brains. Brains are incredibly lazy, and 9 times out of 10, they're just going to latch on to whatever it is that you said last. So while they're awesome, they can also take the quickest route. And interviewing in general, while it's not a totally uncomfortable experience, most everyone is absolutely willing to talk about their feelings and their experience and what their thoughts are. People love talking about themselves. That's such a truth, right? But sometimes interviews can be a little bit stressful or awkward, especially if the customer or the person you're interviewing is really distracted and they just want the quickest out, basically, to the question. This is why I always recommend just ask your question and then don't say anything else. Stay silent. It's going to feel awkward, but I promise you, you're going to get way better results and responses when you just shut up and say nothing. Just let the air take over, and it's probably really weird, but you will get better at this. Just ask and then pause. Don't do nothing else. And if someone asks you for a follow-up, like, I don't really know what you mean by that, you can ask your question in a different way. But try not to give answers or solutions, because like I said, most people will just latch onto that. Okay, so you are in the interview, you're asking your questions, you're getting some really good insight. Here's something to remember and to keep in the back of your mind as you are listening and taking in information. There's two things. The first is, if you are a technical founder, if you are a technical person or you are a product person, it is going to be really, really, really natural for you to want to just skip to product. And I promise you that depending on the kind of research that you're doing, that could be a hugely missed opportunity when it comes to using the time that you have with the customer. If, for example, you're doing customer research to help you better understand your acquisition strategies, or if you're doing research to help you better understand activation, then the questions that you're going to ask, yes, could absolutely be related to product and should be in some way, because obviously you want to get some feedback from the customer about the product. But if it's about acquisition, you want to make sure to spend a lot of your time in the actual psychology of choosing a solution and finding it and deciding, like, well, why is this one better than this one? And like, why did you decide to do this? What was really painful about these things? You don't really want to spend a ton of time in the product itself, because it's not necessarily going to give you context about the actual customer journey. So that's why it's really critical to make sure that you've got the right context and the right strategy for your research, but then also make sure that just be aware of your own bias and your own natural tendency to want to dig into something, especially if you're a technical founder, especially if you're a product person, and the interview is, of course, going to cover some product, but just make sure that you're actually balancing the amount of time that you're spending in any given area. And also make sure that you're actually getting the answers that you need. Because like I said, it's really easy to just slip into, let's just only talk about this. And if you've got the time with the customer, try your absolute best to actually balance out your research with what you really need to get done to be successful. So just be aware of that. Okay, right after that. So like I said, we're being self-aware. We're making sure that we've got a really good plan and good strategy for our customer research. However, here's something that I would also just be listening for. There are words and phrases in the human lexicon, whether you are English speaking or French speaking or any language. There are certain words that are just really common that people say that, for better or for worse, are what we would consider kind of lazy. And no shade, of course, to the people saying them or to the customers themselves or to prospects, but there are definitely what we would call lazy words, words that are just really easy to say but don't actually mean anything. We also consider these to be cliche. You can also think of these as cliched statements, but you should be listening for a few trigger words, or these lazy words as we call them. And it is pretty much exactly what you would expect. It's words like easy, what does easy really mean? Easy how? Fast. This is a really common one. Easy is also really common, but fast is a really, like fast how, like fast and that it saved you time. But even then, what does that mean? There's a few words that are like that always triggers me to actually dig deeper. So there's probably a few words that you're going to notice that customers will say that when you hear them, they might make sense, but that's actually an assumption that you're making as the interviewer. So it's critical, super important to actually dig deeper whenever you hear words like that. And it's going to vary just from like a business to business perspective, but words that we hear all the time are like that easy, fast, this saved me time. Gosh, there's tons more, of course, that I'm totally blanking on. Ooh, okay, yes. Okay, so we have internally a list of trigger words that we use that it just raises like a little like exclamation point to like, oh, like we need to dig deeper into that. So that's what we do. Simple. This is a good one. Simple, that's a trigger word for us. It just means that simple, like in what way? Like what does that actually mean? Like compared to what? And the way that I like to actually dig deeper into words that kind of don't really mean anything anymore to us, especially as researchers, interviewers, and just people in SaaS, is always dig deeper, but we ask, help me understand, simple how, or easy how, in what way? Those are my favorite ways to follow up on trigger words or lazy words like that. Saved time is a big one. If you ever hear this saved me time, get into the nitty gritty details of how did that save you time? What are you comparing that to that makes you feel like you've saved time or that you've quantitatively saved time? That's where the secret sauce is. That's where the deep insight is. It's not in these filler words or trigger words that that we think of. If you hear things like that, and there might actually be some specific even for your customer interviews, the more that you do them, the more that you'll pick up on them, and the more that you're going to start to ask why. And the reason, and I think that's such a critical part of that process. You never want to assume what someone means. You always want to really understand and to again just dig a little deeper. That was a really long-winded way of saying, listen for trigger words, and when you hear them, follow up. Ask why, ask how, make comparisons. Just don't be afraid to follow up to what the customer was saying. This is something that also happens quite often, especially if you are talking to someone who is really distracted or there is something else going on. And sometimes you can ask a question, but you don't actually get an answer that correlates to the question. The customer might answer in a completely different way. This actually happened to me recently where I was on a customer interview and I was asking questions like, well, what led you to looking for a solution like this in the first place? And I think that the customer was just really distracted because they were just like, oh yeah, well, we've been using it about 10 years. And I was like, that wasn't my question. And what I did was I was just like, okay, interesting. So well, wait, like let's go back to the process of you needing, like you were experiencing something, like what happened that made you start looking for the solution? So I kind of had to ask the question again in a different way, but it happens. And your job as the interviewer, as the researcher, founder, marketer, whoever's doing this interview, it's your job to make sure that you extract the response, the insight, and that it actually correlates to what the question is about in the first place. I am definitely fearless when it comes to digging deeper and to also making sure that I got my answer. It might not be the answer that I wanted to hear, but it actually answered the question. And that is, again, it comes with practice, but just make sure that you're actually listening for those things as well. If you find yourself kind of going like, was that a real answer to that question? Don't hesitate to at the end of the interview, go back to it. I do that all the time, especially if I kind of feel like we didn't really dig deep enough or we didn't really get an answer to that question and it's not really clear, especially after the interview. So I highly recommend just listening for consistency and an actual connection between the question that you're asking and then the answer that you're hearing. If it seems logical, great. If it seems like it doesn't fit or it doesn't match or like the customer didn't answer and like they didn't just really answer the question like at all, they answered something else completely different, then you know to follow up and to dig deeper into that. Okay. And then here's the thing. All right. You've done your research. You've asked your questions. You're coming up on time. What do you do next? There's a couple of things that you can do, depending on the nature, of course, of your research. But I just want to plant a few seeds here, because if you've got the customer on the call already, then there's a lot of opportunity here. You can ask the customer if they would be open to using the interview as a case study. And then you might have a few follow-up questions to make a more rounded out, complete case study. The kind of research that we do matches really well to the kind of research that you would do for a case study. We would just need to ask a couple of extra questions for it to be like a more of a case study interview. But everything else, it aligns really well. Now, of course, this is going to depend on what kind of research you're doing and what you're asking asking the customers themselves. But if you have them on the call, at the end of it, if you think that they're a good fit for a case study, ask them and actually get a verbal commitment right there. It works wonders. There are a few industries where this doesn't work as well. So for example, universities and enterprise, sorry, if you're targeting those kinds of clients or customers and you're talking to one on the phone or Zoom, whatever, I'd be shocked if they said yes immediately. But SMBs, most of them are like, yeah, let's do it. Let's turn this interview into a case study and I don't have to talk to you for like a third time. I'm just kidding. Customers love talking to founders and to teams and to marketers in general, especially when the product is like really solving a lot of pain for them. They love it. They really do. Anyway, I digress. So that is one thing that you can do. And then after it's all said and done, you pretty much wrap it all up. You get your recording, you get your transcript, and then you go about your merry way. What my personal favorite thing to do with customer research, I actually like surprising customers with a reward of some kind after. It's such a... It really just depends on your customer base and your customer culture, if it makes sense to incentivize the interview or not. I recommend don't incentivize the interview at the front. So don't offer a gift card if people would participate in the research. You just don't get as good research. It's just simply true. You get a lot of people who aren't invested really in your product, but they are invested in that gift card or the gift or the thing. Some people do feel compelled to offer something for free, but I always recommend starting your research process, not offering anything at all and just seeing what comes through. I think you'd be really surprised that people do actually want to talk to you. It terrifies so many founders and teams to just ask with nothing necessarily in return. If you decide to go that route where you don't offer an incentive up front to do the research itself, then I actually love surprising them with it later, because it's kind of like a thank you so much. I didn't realize that, that this was going to happen in this way, or, oh, like that was so nice. I feel like that, that felt mutually beneficial because it's just me doing a lot of talking and the other person doing a lot of note-taking and listening. And no, that can feel kind of one-sided sometimes. So I love surprising them with it later. And this could be honestly anything. It could be a gift card. It could also be like a little, thank you box. Totally, the world is your oyster when it comes to what you can surprise your customers with. All right, my friends, we have talked all about how to run your customer research interviews like a pro. I promise if you follow these tips, you're going to sound like you know what you're doing. You're going to actually be way more confident when you go into these interviews. And then finally, when you come out of your interviews, you're actually going to have a much better chance of getting the insight that you need in order to apply to your challenge or business, what have you. Thank you so much for watching. My name is Asia. I hope you had a great time. You should think about subscribing if you like this kind of content, because we're going to keep creating it. So, yeah. Oh, man. Everyone's like, unsubscribe. Thank you so much again. I hope this was helpful. Let me know in the comments down below what you thought. What are some of the other things that you do to make your customer research interviews amazing? And what are some of the things that you also recommend to never do? Because there are definitely the don't do's as well. All right, guys, thank you so much. Bye.